Thank you. So I'm an associate professor in the geography department at Central Washington University in the northwest of the United States. And I teach courses, technical courses on GIS and also geography courses on Latin America. So I was thrilled to hear that FOSS4G this year would be in Brazil. There was no way I would miss this. And great to have a crowd of faithful and enthusiastic people here at the end of the conference. Thanks for sticking around. So I really loved the keynote. Well, I guess to start, I'm going to be sharing a little bit of insights that I derived when using GIS to study the diary of a Brazilian author. Her name was Carolina Maria de Jesus, and she wrote a book about her life on the margins of São Paulo in the 1950s in this neighborhood. But first, I really liked the keynote where Gilberto Câmara said, read the classics over and over. As an academic, I thought it was funny that he kept putting the key papers in the discipline, very appropriate. So I'm going to start with a little bit of the classics when talking about perception of space in the urban environment. How do we see the city? And people have been studying this for decades. One of the classics in that genre is Kevin Lynch's book, The Image of the City. He was interested in how people see a complex city like what you have on the left. How do they visualize that space in their minds and relate to it? And so in his book, he interviewed a bunch of people and had them make mental maps and tried to distill like an essential map of the geography of that city with the primary edges and barriers and paths that they perceived. But in addition to each person having their own perceptions of and usage of space, that perception and usage of space is influenced by social circumstances. So in this study in the 70s, they used Lynch's elements of mental maps and asked different populations in Los Angeles to draw their mental map of the city. Now, Los Angeles is a complex, sprawling city with lots of different neighborhoods. On the left is the composite map made by people in the neighborhood of Boyle Heights, which was a lower income neighborhood that people had less opportunity to travel around and to get around the area. And the one on the right was made by residents of Westwood, where there's much higher income and mobility, having a more expansive mental map. But income is not the only factor that could influence a person's perception of space and ability to move around it. Feminist geographers like Gillian Rose and May-Po Kwan have shown how women might perceive spaces and their safety and ability to navigate to those in different ways than men. And so we have other aspects of identity, such as gender, coming into play, as well as time throughout the day, which could influence where we go and how we experience space. So May-Po Kwan has made these like 3D space-time cubes. This one shows the movement of African American women throughout the day in Portland, Oregon, and how they move through space. So I've been interested in the perception of space and mapping people's experiences as written in diaries. And before I get into talking about Carolina Maria de Jesus, I'll show just some groundwork I was doing last year in a project with a very different diary in a very different place. So these are some maps that I made from the diary of Elizabeth Corin. She was an immigrant to the United States from Norway in 1854. And her diary is unique in that not many Norwegian immigrant women wrote about their experiences in this level of detail. And she described her walks around the landscape, all the homes of people that she visited for different reasons. And there was enough detail in the diary that I wanted to map this. So I tried to create a base map of what that neighborhood would have looked like in 1854, where the families lived, and then map the walks that she described around the landscape. So this is kind of like her Strava file, if you could imagine, from 1854. But then I wanted to apply GIS techniques to understand these a little better. So one that I've used in this case was kernel density functions, looking at the differences in spatial patterns of the different kinds of walks. So sometimes she walked in order to exchange goods with people in the community, because that's how they survived. Other times she walked to visit friends and make social connections. those walks have different geographic patterns. And so putting them side by side in this way, we could compare. I was also experimenting with emotion mapping. So anytime she mentioned a particular feeling on the landscape, I classified it into positive or negative and put it as a point, and then used density surfaces to create these regions of more pleasant emotions shown in green and more unpleasant regions shown in yellow. So just trying to experiment with GIS techniques mixed with these historical diary sources. That's where I've been in the past year. This is an article that will be published later this month that you could go to if you wanted more detail, and I'll share the slides at the end. So on to the current project, and this is still under development, and I would really welcome ideas and thoughts and feedback. I was reading this book by Carolina Maria de Jesus, Quarto de Despejo, where she describes her life in São Paulo in the 1950s. This was published in 1960. It's one of the best-selling books in Brazil. And in English, it was also published under the title Child of the Dark. Show of hands, has anybody heard of this book? If you've heard of this. One? Okay. Have you read this book? No? Yes. Okay. So I will give some background so that people know. I had not heard of this book until I got into reading these diaries and Brazilian literature. But it was fascinating to me. So Carolina Maria de Jesus was born in the interior state of Minas Gerais, I think in the mid-1920s. Her grandfather had been in slavery, and so her family did not have many resources, and she eventually migrated to São Paulo to look for work as a young woman. She worked in a variety of jobs and eventually wound up doing a lot of housekeeping work, but was fired from her job when she became pregnant. The father of that child abandoned them, basically, and then from that point on, she constructed a shack and lived on the margins of São Paulo in this neighborhood called Favela do Canindé. Eventually, she had several other children that she also took care of on her own. The way that she survived was by gathering scraps of paper and metal, anything in the street that she could sell to live from day to day to care for her family. Eventually, one of the things that she did to cope with the stress and the difficulty of this was writing. She wanted to be an author. She was an author. She would write on pieces of paper that she gathered out of the garbage that had no writing on them. And she wrote stories, novels, poems, and she also wrote a very detailed diary talking about what she did from day to day. One day, a reporter came to the neighborhood and discovered that she had this diary. She told him about it, and he agreed he wanted to publish some of it. And he edited it for length. He did not change the wording, but he cut out parts just to make it short enough. And some parts of it appeared in this national magazine, O Cruzeiro. Eventually, a book was made out of this, which is the one I showed, Quarto de Despejo, and it was published and became one of the best-selling books in Brazil. This was during a time period in Brazil where the narrative from the government was one of economic boom and growth in the 50s. But what was happening was the inflation was crushing people in Carolina's neighborhood who lived in where she did. And that side of the story wasn't being shown. And so people were really interested in this story that they had not heard or seen, written by somebody who hadn't really had a kind of a voice. When I read this, I was really interested in Carolina's attention to geography and place. She mentions in very specific detail addresses that she went to, street intersections that she went to, the different resources that she gained there, and why she was going different places. And so, having been working on that other mapping from the 1800s from in the United States, I decided, well, what if I tried to continue to apply and develop these techniques with this book? One thing I was really interested in was her perception of the city versus where she lived herself in the favela, or the informally developed neighborhood of Canindé. She clearly felt, from the text, it's clear to me that she felt she did not belong in the city, but it was some place that was kind of different to her. She said, when I'm in the city, I have the impression that I am in a living room with crystal chandeliers, rugs of velvet, and satin cushions. And when I'm in the favela, I have the impression that I'm a useless object, destined to be forever in a garbage dump. So I wanted to see how those things played out in the map, because when I looked at where the favela do Canindé was, it didn't appear to me to be very far away from the center of São Paulo, given the full urban scene. Like, it's only a couple kilometers away. So how did she develop this feeling? So this required first creating a base map of São Paulo in that time from the 1950s. And there were a couple of resources that were really helpful with that. We started with OpenStreetMap from the modern day, which we just used quick OSM to download it. And then there's this company, GeoPortal, that had published online aerial photographs from 1958 for the public to view in this interactive viewer. Well, 1958 is where most of that diary was written, so this was perfect. We overlaid the street data on the imagery and then modified the streets to remove things that were not there in 1958. And this gave opportunity for some of our students to practice. So I had a student who helped me with this, who's working on her GIS degree, who was helping manage this data. Another map that was useful, that was open online, was published on the GeoSampa site by the Prefecture of São Paulo. They have a digital map site with lots of historic maps, and one of them is from 1954, this Vasco series. These are line drawings of the plan of São Paulo that show how this neighborhood looked back then. And it's very, very different today, because if you've been to São Paulo, there's like 12 lanes of expressway on each side of this river, and it's all channelized, right? So it was helpful to have maps from that time period. These maps have the streetcar lines from that day, which was helpful for us. And also at each intersection, there's a point with the elevation, which helped us to create an elevation surface from the time, because this area has been heavily re-engineered. We couldn't use like LiDAR from the current day, because it would have all kinds of stuff that wasn't there back in the 50s. So I had another alum who was trying to get some more GIS experience, and she helped with this part of digitizing these spot heights and then the streetcar lines. Well, then it was time to go through the book and try to map out the places that were mentioned. So I went through the book in English and Portuguese and kind of made a little database of any place that was mentioned, and then set out to try and find where those places were in 1960. A lot of them are not there anymore, and so we had to use a variety of techniques to do that. From my home in the United States, using the internet, I was able to find about 25 to 30 of those locations just from the resources I had. Spending some time in São Paulo, going to the Mario de Andrade Library. Their staff was very helpful. Also in a rare bookshop, I found an old phone book from 1955 that was a gold mine of information. It had the street guide. It listed every business and residence on each street and names alphabetically. And then using some of the unedited diary entries that were later published in English, we were able to find about 20 more locations. So we had about 50 places in the book that we could find. If you just put those 50 points onto a map, this is where those land. So where she lived was the Canindé favela up here. You can see a lot of points around there. The city center is to the southwest, about 3 or 4 kilometers, and then there's a lot of activity just to the west of where her neighborhood was. And you can see a little bit of the shaded relief in the background that we had derived from those elevation points, where the city center lies up a bit higher and has more relief than the area by the river. So none of these are labeled here or classified or anything, but I want to break down those points a little more based on what was going on in those areas. First of all, most of the stuff in the book that we could identify occurred within about a 3-kilometer walk of her home. So we used the service area tools in QGIS with the street network we had made to see how far she would have to walk to reach a lot of these points. Now, the streetcar cost money, so it represented an investment if she wanted to go anywhere that was outside of walking range. When walking places, she was usually going with her 5-year-old daughter and carrying a large sack full of stuff that she was collecting to sell. So those were kind of limiting factors on movement. And so this GIS approach can help us just understand a little better some of the patterns of movement and some of the efforts that would have been required to reach particular places. Now, what are these points that lie outside of that area? Something that can help us to understand that is by breaking up these points thematically based on what she was doing during that time. So the points that are in orange represent things related to her personal life, social interactions, things that she might have done for leisure. And there weren't very many of those because usually she was working to feed her family. Like everything she did was related to getting resources. So there's a lot more points that are blue that represent things that happened while she was out gathering paper, cardboard, metal, and other things to sell. Or even just scraps from food markets or food processing houses and things like that. The green points here represents institutions and services mentioned in the book where she also was able to get resources. And these are things like government institutions that she needed to interact with, or places that offered medical care, and other kinds of institutions, charitable organizations that sometimes gave food and clothing. The thing about these is you can see that they lie much farther away from her home. So to get to those resources, she had to make an investment in travel. It was more difficult for her to reach. And these questions of distance and access to basic needs are ones that are not just there in 1960. These are the same ones that we deal with and think about today in the question of urban geography. To summarize these point patterns, I was experimenting with some of the techniques that we use in GIS to summarize patterns. So there is a standard deviation ellipse plugin in QGIS that was used here can summarize the expansiveness and orientation of a point pattern. And so I have used that on the left and kernel density surfaces on the right to try and summarize these patterns and give us a quicker look at where it's the most density. I call these different realms of her daily life, personal life, work, and institutions and services. In reality, these may not be so cleanly separated. Some of the things she did involved two of those things at once. In fact, whenever she went to institutions or did anything personally, she was always looking around for valuable things that she could gather and sell. I have been, as I've done these projects, I've found a lot of interesting ideas from feminist thought in cartography that I've wanted to apply here. And two of those thoughts are trying to orient the map around the person being described, rather than just having kind of this depersonalized view from way up above. The other is putting the person's own words on the map. So I'd like to just show some cases where I've tried to do that with this data. This is a map just with a 3D view in QGIS showing Carolina's point of view as she looked toward the city. Remembering, she considered that as a beautiful living room, and she lived in the junk room. That's what Quarto de Despejo means, the junk room in the back. We see it between her and the city. It's a little easier in this 3D view to see some of those barriers, or at least that might be perceived on the ground. To get there, she would have had to navigate kind of an irregular maze of streets. There aren't a lot of direct ways to get to the downtown. There is the Tietê River here and some major roads. And then the city literally lying above where she did. Those institutions and services that were available in the center of the city can look really far away here when you consider those barriers and see from this point of view. When it comes to putting her words on the map, I've been experimenting with kind of making this map of resource access, which I've made available here on this QR code if you want to browse it. What I did was took some passages that I just felt were representative of this out of the English version of the book. And then I made a few icons using Inkscape. I'm not an artist. A graphic designer would be able to help me quite a bit here. But just some things related to accessing food, water, and clothing, work resources like paper and boxes, and then money that was spent or gained. That's what I'm emphasizing on this map. So just zooming in a little bit, here are a few examples surrounding her home. This is where she lived. Water was something that was all around because the Tietê River was there. But it was heavily contaminated even back then and brought a lot of health hazards to the community. There was one public spigot that had been installed, but sometimes that didn't work. So on the left, the other water icon talks about a time where one day we went to get water and didn't find the public spigot turned on. I carried water from Guaporé Street from the place where I sell paper. In the other map that I showed previously with the walk times, we can tell that that's about 2 to 3 kilometers to walk to carry that water for herself and her children. Some other examples of where she obtained paper. Let's see, 14th of August, a woman who was returning from the market told me to go and look for paper at Porto Seguro Street, the building on the corner. Using that old aerial imagery and our street directory, that was easy to find what building that was, and so we're able to put that event on the map. Another time, I went to Dona Julita and picked up her paper. I earned 55 cruceros. What does 55 cruceros buy? On the very same day, we find out what it had to buy was dental care for her son. So he had a toothache. She just went to the dentist nearest where she lived. She said, I thought the price was exorbitant, but Joao was already sitting in the dentist chair. I separated 20 bills of 5 to pay the dentist. So putting the person's words on the map can make the map unique to them. It helps us understand how those different aspects of identity kind of guided them as they used space and went different places in the city, and we get a clearer picture of what her life was like. Is getting close to the end of my time. I just want to talk about this last theme of her overall geographies in the book as compared to all of São Paulo. So we could zoom way out here on this imagery and still be seeing lots of development of the city. The area covered in the book, just represented by those yellow dots, is a relatively small part of São Paulo, even back then. Once she started gaining royalties from the sale of the book, she wrote another diary that was eventually published. And in that diary, you can see how immediately she begins moving further around the city because some of those barriers to transportation are now gone. At the same time, some of the reports published by the social services in São Paulo in 1955 described residents of the favela neighborhood as some of them had not left the neighborhood in several years. And so Carolina's geography may have even been a little more expansive than some of her neighbors. We don't know. But it's important to see it in context, and other researchers have pointed out how her geographies were fairly limited in that regard during this time. Yes. We're totally out of time. Oh. 2 minutes. Okay. All right. Well, I am at the end. So anyway.